series of seminars for exploring transition design. And we thought, cool, like let's try our luck and reach out to him to see if he might be interested to do something with us. And he's very generously agreed to run like a series of exploration on how those of us in the program now, as we are working on our major projects, how we might be able to apply transition design approaches and techniques into our service design projects. And I think in the spirit of transition design, we're also trying to explore how this could be a mutually beneficial thing without like any exchange of money or any formal agreements in that kind of way. So this is very much inspired by things like a trade school or a collaborative circle, and we're hoping that as we get to benefit from Cameron's expertise in transition design and knowledge, we're hoping that our experimenting with transition design within our projects could also offer like new insights and help to deepen transition design. And why we're opening this up to anyone else interested also is still like in this spirit of like collaboration and exploring systems outside of capitalism. And so we're really happy for others to join us, and throughout the session, if you have any questions, if you have any thoughts, any comments, please feel free to type in the chat, and we'll try to find a space to also include questions from outside of the participating students. So a brief context what will happen is this is going to be a series of 5 sessions coming up. This will be the first. We have 2 sessions of learning more about like the theory behind specific techniques that Cameron feels would be suitable for some of our major projects that we've already shared with him. And then we'll have a little bit of a break in between the next 2 sessions, which will be about theory. And then we have 2 sessions that are more like a crit session where the students will try out those techniques that are suggested, and then we'll talk about what's happened. The students will present like how they've tried it, what they've learned, and then we'll have a discussion about that. And then the 5th and the last session will be just a collective reflection on what this whole thing has been and whether we've learned anything. So if you're welcome to join us, and if you know of anyone else who might be interested in something like this, please feel free to share our Slack channel with them, feel free to like reach out to us as well. One last thing, just administrative. We are hoping to record this call. So just FYI, if you are uncomfortable with anything being recorded, just reach out to me or Alex, and we'll manage that. Yeah. With that, I think, Alex, am I forgetting anything?
No, all good. The call has been recorded now, so I think we're all set to go.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Over to you, Cameron. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you. That was a perfect introduction. Just to confirm, everything that was said is certainly my understanding about how we're doing this. I'm really grateful that you have all given up a little bit of your late summer to participate in this. And as Damien indicated, I'm very keen to learn from you about what works and doesn't work in what we've tried to start developing under transition design, and definitely hoping that you can contribute to it by building out new types of perspectives and tools and talking about them. And the aim is to make sure that there are only ever transition designers and never anybody designing for the status quo. So this is the beginning of the revolution, and you are some of the first. So that's fantastic. I'm speaking to you from the city that's called Sydney. This is the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. This is unceded land. It was land that was stolen from those people. Some of you may be aware that Australia is about to have a referendum in which it is proposed that those people who are the longest standing civilization of humans in any one place, 50, 60,000 years at least, of knowing how to be sustainably in this land down here, to actually recognise them in the Constitution and create a standing body to give them voice on matters that concern them, because for the last 200 plus years of occupation, people have just instead legislated over them and on them, and it has had obviously terrible consequences. It's not going well. I could harken back to the Chilean referendum that just went through, the attempt to put in a new constitution after Pinochet. It starts well, lots of really interesting things, but it's amazing how strong institutional mainstream regimes are when they have control of the media and can kind of get hold of that discourse. So I'm being blatantly propagandistically political here, but I do think it's important that we do think about these larger transitions that we're all trying to be part of, some of which could do with some design, but I'm not sure that transition design is well structured to help things like this when you start moving to actual democratic processes of constitutional recognition. Transition design can help, but it is not the thing that can accomplish it. And yeah, I just wanted to provide that as a bit of a context. So thank you. Just a quick sort of introduction, locating where I'm coming from. Tonight, I'm just going to try and talk to you quickly about another Chilean developmental economist, philosopher, sociologist, Manfred Max Neef. I'm going to talk to you about that because it is a crucial part of one of the theories that Terry Gideon and I sort of recommend that designers use in order to get their head around transition design. And it is a big challenge to one of the central platforms of most ordinary forms of design, particularly UX, which is a sort of Maslowian account of human needs. So with Manfred Max Neef's version of needs, you do challenge a particular version of the human-centered design. It's not more than human design. It's just thinking differently about diverse humans through the concept of need. Now, I've chosen to speak to you about this because I think it's a good way of saying transition design is a collection of theoretical frameworks that we try to bring to design from outside design to make designers learn new perspectives so that they design differently. I think it certainly struck me as something that would just be a good introduction for some of the projects I looked at. So right at the end, I'll just reference some of the projects, but I'm very hesitant to do that because I'm not familiar with the work other than the brief abstracts that have been shared with me. So I will just talk quickly about the way in which what I've spoken about might translate to those contexts. And I'll be more interested to hear from the project members themselves about how they understand that. But I'm also doing this because I think it's a great switch point, particularly between service design and transition design. So just knowing that a lot of you have been studying service design and are now doing transition design thesis projects within a service design master's, I thought it was a good way of sort of making that bridge. So the first half of what I'll talk about will sort of introduce it by way of service design. I'm going to share some slides. I think when I do that, I can't see you or the chat, but apparently you can still see me. So it's a bit unnerving because I just suddenly start talking into the ether, which means that if anything goes wrong or you suddenly want to ask a question, you just have to start yelling. And that will be totally fine with me. Just start going, ah, and I'll stop and then try and get out of the share. So I hope that sounds okay. Okay. I did get a small window in one corner. Excellent. All right. So you're looking at UAL servicing needs, Manfred Max Neef.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Great. Okay. I'm going to begin sort of quite philosophically with what I understand to be how I would define service. So it's a very particular definition, and I'm going to say service is care. There's obviously a difference between service and care. Not all acts of care are service, though one would hope all acts of service are full of care. But I think it's only particular types of care between, in the third line there, strangers, that actually needs designing. So you only need to design relations of care. I think I said this last time we met, when these are occurrences between strangers. And so the sort of sociality of people helping each other needs to be helped. It needs to be coordinated, it needs to be designed to help those strangers help each other. But I think one of the other fundamental things to think about, which is the connection with what I want to talk to you about tonight, is that service is care of someone with a need. So we often talk about service being the co-creation of value between, as if two equal parties, in a kind of service dominant logic way of thinking about service. But I think it's always important to remember the relation is fundamentally asymmetrical, which doesn't necessarily mean that one is more powerful than the other, but it just means that one has a need and they can't service that need by themselves, which is why they need somebody else. And as I said, possibly last time, I always approach service only really with an interest in people-based services. I do not agree with anybody who calls UX a type of service design. I think it's a type of self-service design, but I don't think it's a type of service design. So I'm really interested in service design insofar as it is encounters between strangers who collaborate to help one of them who has a need. And that's why I'm going to talk about needs tonight. And so just to put this in a perspective, if you have needs, these can be serviced by yourself. It can be DIY. There is something that you could do. So, if you are hunger, you can satiate that by going and foraging and feeding yourself and preparing a meal, or catching a meal if it's alive and you still eat other animals, etc. So you can service needs by yourself. Often there are needs that you can't satisfy yourself. You need the help of friends, family, or community members. But as I said before, hopefully those don't need designing. I think it's a bit weird to crowd out social relations with design if there is an existing relation. So I'd say this is the difference between a relationship, friend, family, community, is a relationship, in which case you don't need to design the servicing. And all this, by the way, would be controversial, and we could talk about it. It's just particular definitions that I'm using, but it's just for tonight, I'm only saying this to get to the concept of needs, so we can come back to this. So you can service needs by yourself, friends, family, or community members, or by a stranger. If you're going to induce a stranger to help you, there are lots of different ways in which humans do that. They might gift things. This is a type of gift economy, as Damon explained at the beginning. It's a gifting that might set up situations of social relationship, of debt, of people feeling like they need to repay the gift somehow. And then most of design, which is not service design, tries to design products, things, systems that can service a need through the thing. The thing does the work of a person, but in place of a person. So if I need a door opened and I can't open it because my hands are full, I either need a door opener, a stranger who's going to open the door for me, or I need to actually make a technological door opener, something that is going to open the door in that way. So I have needs and they can be serviced in all these different ways. The reason I'm labouring this kind of philosophic introduction is that I'm trying to sensitize you to thinking about the concept of needs and how central they are to what it means to be a designer. And then just two other quick philosophic points and one way of resolving it, which might not be news to you, but I think that two of the fundamental paradoxes of service design are that because there is one person who needs some kind of help that they can't help themselves with or don't have a product to help themselves with, there will always be some kind of dependence. One could say that all service, if not all design, has a deficit mindset, in that it presumes that one of the party has a deficit, has some lack, has some need, and they are dependent upon this other person to come and help them. But on the other hand, we know that one of the now I'm deliberately troubling here. I don't know whether to call this a need or not. One of the things that we hope humans give to each other through design is autonomy. So we know that when you are trying to help someone who is dependent, if you merely help them in a paternalistic way, in a patronizing way, in a condescending way, in a deficit mindset way, you will be reinforcing their dependence. You'll be helping them, but they will become more dependent, or you will make them feel dependent on the help you're providing. So there's this paradox that all service relations are relations of dependence, and yet the aim of the service design is to help people feel autonomous, or as autonomous as possible, before, after, and sometimes during that engagement. So there's this paradox of dependent autonomy. And then the second paradox of service is that you're always trying to help someone. So the service worker is trying to help the service recipient. But as you all know, if you've had experience designing services, particularly people-based services, you are trying to get a situation of co-creation of value. So you're trying to get to a situation in which the service recipient helps the service worker service them, that they receive the service in the right way, they ask for the service in the right way, they receive the service in the right way. So they're actually a co-creator of the value, they're collaborating, they're not merely being passive, even if their action is to try and remain still. So I'm calling this helping. There's this paradox where the helper, the helped, has to help the helper help them. Don't know if you got that, might have to say it again. The helped helps the helper help them. And I think this is the fundamental tension in service design. How to resolve this, I think, is one of the best clues I've ever come across is from Miso Kim's work. Now, do people know Miso Kim? When I first started working at Carnegie Mellon University, she was one of the last of Richard Buchanan's PhD students, and she was completing, and so I was there as she did her defense. Miso Kim is a service design academic and practitioner, and her PhD was on dignity in service design. So I think one of the fundamental principles we aim for as service designers is trying to ensure that all services are dignified for all involved, not just the recipient, but also the service worker. We want it to be dignified help. We want it to be dignified work. We want it to be, if it has to be dependent, dignified dependence that has aspects of autonomy to it in order to make it more dignified. So these are the key paradoxes in my mind for service design. Now, the reason I tell you all that, I'm telling a long story around, sorry, I'll try and go a bit faster. As you, I hope, also realize, the way I've been describing service is just two people, service worker, service recipient. But if you have to design a service, then you have to organize it, which means you tend to have an organization that makes it regular. I think it's unusual to design an organizationless service. Services are things organizations provide. They get people to help people, strangers to help strangers, under the umbrella of the organization, which means all services are triadic. They have this tension. The customer is trying to get something from the organization via the personnel here, via the service worker. The service worker is merely trying to get paid by the service organization, but in order to get paid, they have to help the customer. The customer is trying to control the personnel is trying to control the customer, and then there's these other tensions of efficiency, autonomy, and customization, I would call it, rather than satisfaction. So there's this tension, and one of the fundamental things service designers have to do is negotiate this tension and try and make sure that there is dignity in all these tensions, these paradoxes, these triadic relations. Okay, so all of that was the setup to explain Maslow. I don't know how many people know Abraham Maslow. You all know Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's apparently one of the most cited diagrams in the history of the social sciences. I'm not sure how you would prove that, but someone once made that claim. But I don't know how many people know anything about where Maslow is from. The fact that he kind of birthed organizational psychology. The idea that you would actually apply psychology to organizations and to this question of management. So there were others in this area, but he was a particularly defining figure in bringing this. The other person in this who does a lot of work on organizational culture and organizational psychology is Edgar Schein. I don't know how many people have come across Edgar Schein's work. The really interesting, sorry, total aside here, but the really interesting thing about Edgar Schein is that a lot of his original theories about organizational change came from research he did into supposed brainwashing in the Korean War. So I'll just leave that as a little anecdote. It's slightly more complicated than I'm saying that, but it's just kind of interesting to think that organizational culture has its basis in conflict, war conflict, brainwashing. Brainwashing doesn't actually exist, by the way, I'll just say that. Maslow was trying to deal with this tension. He was trying to work out, how do you motivate the service worker to care for, in a dignified way, the customer? How do you motivate workers to work, and particularly when that work is not just physical, but has an emotional labor component, where they're going to have to actually act in a particular way. They're going to have to be a particular type of person in a particular type of relation to a customer. How do you motivate them? So the original theory kicking around at the time between him and McGregor was this argument between theory X and theory Y. This is pretty dated organizational psychology that no decent management theorist would subscribe to these days. But it's useful just to get the point. There are apparently the types of workers who are basically refusing to work, in which case you have to incentivize them or disincentivize them in order to make them work and in the right way. So it's a disciplining person, and that's theory X, somebody who really needs to be forced by the organizational design to work. Theory Y is that there are these other people who are making the yes sign there. They enthusiastically will take up the work, and they will get their own satisfiers from doing that work well. So apparently there are these two types of personalities, and if you hire workers who are all theory X's, you're going to have to manage them with command and control, maybe some incentives and rewards. But if you can manage to find theory Y people, all you need to do is tell them what needs to happen, and then they go and do it for their own satisfaction. Now, I tell you this because obviously managers want to know how to get from X to Y. You can have theory X as a service, but it's not going to be very dignified, and it's not going to be very sustainable. You'll have high turnover, you'll have a lot of customer complaints, all that kind of thing. It would be great if you could find just theory Y people. Neoliberalism is, as we mentioned at the beginning, the dominant philosophy telling us that we should all do what we love, and we should treat our workplaces like family. And that's all about kind of versions of theory Y. So Maslow kind of came up with theory Z, and Maslow's theory Z is the kind of Maslow hierarchy of needs, which is, if you want to control people, there are these basic needs that they have, and you can give them satisfiers or refuse them satisfiers, or tell them you're only going to give them those base level satisfiers, and they will then do things to get them because they have to. They have to kind of do these base needs, physiological and to some extent safety, as two types of base needs that they need to meet. So you can sort of manage theory X's by managing the distribution of those needs. So this is somebody who cannot eat unless they have enough money from their employer to go and buy food after work. And as a result, that person's going to be forced to work. They're not going to work very well. It's not going to be good service. It's not going to be a sustainable relation. It's not a viable version of society. It's quite alienated. But if you can satisfy, according to the theory, these needs, then they will move into a situation of seeking other types of need satisfaction, higher order needs, as they're called. They will be interested in seeking the esteem of their colleagues or self-actualizing by solving problems on their own, etc. So I think you're all familiar with this. This is very dominant. This will be a framework used a lot in UX, saying you just need to meet the basic needs of ensuring that it's cheap and fast and painless. You do all your sort of pain points, you get rid of those, and then you can start to focus on delight and experience. You can focus on the X of the UX if you satisfy the base needs of the U and go up to the X. Now, I've labeled all this just to explain it because I think it's important to realize that it's a motivational theory of need. It's this question of how do you actually take what people need and drip feed it so that you can turn them into the type of people who are going to provide appropriate service. So Maslow is actually much more interesting this if you actually read him. He's a child of the 1960s and the counterculture. He was into happenings and events. He didn't put self-actualization up there for no reason. It's what was dominant in his kind of privileged class at the time, in the kind of counterculture on primarily the west coast of America. So it was definitely about sort of framing it that way, and it has a very particular cultural context that it comes from. Organizational psychology, and then a particular moment in history in North America. Now, just a quick pause to say it's always represented like this as it's called the pyramid, but it's not a pyramid, it's a triangle. If it was a pyramid, it would be three-dimensional. These are odd graphical forms. They do indicate that you have to go through each stage to climb up, which is how the graphic kind of communicates. But there is an implication that there are more physiological needs and fewer self-actualization. That's the reason you use a pyramidal visual form, is to say there's more at the bottom and less at the top, which is not actually true in Maslow. And Maslow never depicted it as a triangle. He did refer to it as a hierarchy, but he never depicted it in this way. He never drew diagrams like this. This diagram was invented by, there's a nice article by some New Zealand management theorists on the history of this. It was actually invented by management textbooks just to convey the idea. So whenever you see someone talk about Maslow's pyramid of needs, you should just point out to them that it's not Maslow's pyramid. He talks about hierarchy, but he never depicted it in this way. There was never a happy Maslow with a big moustache leaning over a diagram like this. Okay, I should just say this, you kind of read this and you know it's one of the most cited and it's used a lot in design. I sometimes think people don't realize how important it is. The diagram on the left, I don't have time to explain this, so I'll just be quick. The diagram on the left is what's called an environmental Kuznets curve, and it was used to do a lot of development over the 20th century by developed nations to help developing nations, or what in those days was called the first world helping the third world. And the argument was you have to go through this basic stages of development in economics. So you have to give money to a country so that they plunder their natural resources. So what's happening on the 1, 2 to 4 time affluence on the bottom there is that you are pulling stuff out of the ground and you're doing agriculture and you're doing mining. You're just raw materials. You're doing primary industry. Then as you get wealthy by apparently doing that, though none of these nations did because the money was all World Bank debt and they just had to pay off their debt, and then the developed nations could go in and actually do the second stage themselves. But the next stage was supposedly you would develop industry, secondary manufacturing, and you would start to be able to not plunder your natural environment as much because you were becoming more efficient. And finally, at some point, you're supposed to decouple wealth production from material destruction, and you create a service industry. So all of you are learning service design because supposedly the world is now shifting from primary through secondary to tertiary sectors in economies. That's a kind of Maslowian step. You've gone from basic physiological needs through some kind of manufacturing needs to experience. And of course, this is exactly some of the precursors or adjacent discourses to the whole of service design. The arrival of, you can track it particularly through Pine and Gilmore's publications, classic kind of management theorists who just pump out a book every few years that has an updated version of the previous theory. So you move from mass customization to the experience economy, and then people start to realize the experience economy is quite fake. So you apparently move to the authenticity economy, where people are actually selling true actualization. And it was the same argument made by Richard Florida. If you wanted to attract service industries to your city, you should hold a Mardi Gras. Because if you hold a Mardi Gras, you will both attract homosexual creative class workers, but you'll also indicate to everybody in the service industry who are interested apparently in higher order needs, actualization, diversity, diverse experiences, that this is a city that has sort of creative things going on in it. And so Richard Florida has somewhat recanted that claim. But I just wanted to kind of indicate, you know, you get this pyramid, you think it's just psychology, maybe organizational psychology, but it's kind of macroeconomics, and it has to do with the origin of service design. Okay. So that's where Maslow's hierarchy of needs comes from, but it comes from, it contains a particular understanding of need that I want you to question. So if I were to ask you what a need means, I think you all have some sense that it might be a biological need. And on the other hand, it's just a kind of strong want. So people will often, for example, say that the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy is no longer food and water, but it's actually Wi-Fi. I don't know if you've ever seen people who draw that diagram. And what they're kind of saying there is there's a particular want that's become so strong, it's effectively a base need. And then I think it's important to also think about other types of needs that might be to do with identity and belief that begin to mess with something like a hierarchy. So, you know, according to Maslow, you should not be more committed to your religious beliefs than you are to food and water. And yet we know that the history of religiosity almost always entails periods, if not whole lives, dedicated to curtailing and not satisfying those needs. So immediately you have the religious life just turns the pyramid on its head in that way. And it just causes you to start to think, okay, what is a need? Now, I say that because when you start thinking about the hierarchy, which is kind of wrong, you also start to realize that there are other things that I think are problematic about it. So the system really is about individuals with their theory X or Y, individuals with a personality who have individual needs, and sociality is a higher order need, which means the defining starting point is individual. So it doesn't begin with being social. It's that you attain sociality. So it has this fundamental individuation, which I think is problematic. But the main thing that I want you to get tonight is that it abstracts needs from satisfiers. So it kind of just names all these things there. You can see breathing, food, water. A lot of them, breathing is a verb, but they're mostly nouns, right? So you need property, you need body, you need friendship. They might be abstract nouns, but they're all things, which means that the basic verb of satisfaction is having. So this is a very individualistic, propertied version of a need. And it's part of the problem when you abstract the need from satisfiers. Again, this is very important for service design. I don't know how many of you remember the kind of early days of the sharing economy before it became the gig economy and just started exploiting people. So in the sort of utopian early moment of collaborative consumption, designers would often say what is called functional equivalence. The functional equivalence is a statement like, you don't need a washing machine, you need clean clothes. You don't need a car, you need mobility. You don't need a hole, you don't need a drill, you need a hole in the wall. And it was a really clever way of getting to serviceization. You get from product to service by doing this functional equivalence. You can only do that if you can separate the need from its satisfier, which is exactly what you're doing. You don't need the thing, you need the service that the thing provides. But it still presumes a kind of having propertied thingliness individual. I'm being really theoretical. I'm going to get practical in a sense, but I'm hoping you're all staying with me on this, and I'll try and move a bit faster. Manfred Max Neef is somebody who was concerned about the way development was being handed out to developing nations by places like the World Bank and the IMF, and put up a theory of development. He said development is too Maslowian. So they go in and say, okay, you're a poor country, we'll give you sanitation, we'll give you water. And then we'll give you the capacity to grow agriculture. And then we'll give you housing. We'll give you agriculture first. You have to grow your own food, and then we'll give you housing. And then if we've got housing, we might give you schools. And then when you've got schools, we might give you technology. It was a staged drip of constant indebtedness involved in that version. So it used Maslow to force the sort of gates of development funding. Manfred Max Neef, working in the context of Schumacher, Small is Beautiful, again remembering that Terry Irwin and Gideon Kossoff met at Schumacher College, one of the Schumacher Circle institutions at Dartington in the UK. So there's a kind of connection here. That's why Terry and Gideon bring Max Neef into transition design. It's in their kind of heritage of their own education. So Manfred Max Neef was working in that, not counterculture West Coast America, but instead thinking about alternative economies. And comes up with a non-hierarchical, I'm going to come back to this matrix, but the only thing you need to focus on at the moment are the 10 categories down the left column. So the first thing is Max Neef says, well, here are 10 rough groupings of needs, and I'll come back to this. They're not fixed. He doesn't say they're transcultural. He does sometimes, but he's not really interested in that. But the main thing you just need to recognize is that they're non-hierarchical. So they're all of equal weighting. And people will choose different aspects of human being. Just only focus on the left column there. So subsistence, protection, affection, understanding, participation, idleness. So totally removing any sense that they're a gated step change kind of process. Just kind of saying, okay, there are these needs. I'm hesitating calling them that because it's not what they actually are. But there are these needs that humans have, and they can be categorized this way. Lots of people have come up with different sets of needs, and some of them are non-hierarchical. So this is not actually unique to Max Neef, but it's very useful. It's very useful. And the things I'm telling you tonight, even if you're not interested in service design, in my experience, designers, particularly service designers, who use Max Neef instead of Maslow, have an instant advantage in the market for the types of solutions they develop. This is a market differentiator until everybody starts realizing it. It's much more useful for design than Maslow. So I'm giving you some gold here to repay your tuition debts. Right here, this diagram. You can go and grab. I just grabbed it off the net. You can grab it off the net. This is worth the giving up some of your summer for, just this. But I'll come back and explain how to use it. So it's non-hierarchical. So when needs are abstracted and turned into these kind of abstract concepts of what a need is, which allows something like functional equivalence, there are these dangers that happen when designers design from those needs. And Max Neef, as I said, I'll come back to this, Max Neef runs through those dangers. And I'm going to just tell you what they are now. I'll sort of begin with this one here. So a singular satisfier, he says, is you have a need, which might be subsistence, protection, participation, leisure, etc. And you might design something that satisfies that need. And Max Neef says you can evaluate it and say, well, okay, you've satisfied one single need. It's a singular satisfier, as it says down the bottom there, and it satisfies a single need. It's neutral in terms of the other needs. These are very characteristic, as he says, of development schemes. So this is very like one need, one product. And if you think about it, this is why we have so much stuff. because design has tended to say, identify the job to be done, identify the pain point, identify the value proposition, it's all singular, and just come up with the thing that does it. So you have a specialized product for everything. Sometimes you see those videos online, and not only do they have a particular cleaning device for every particular thing in the house, like a cleaning device for the toilet, obviously, and a cleaning device for the basin, and a cleaning device for the floor, and a cleaning device for the shoe. Like, everything's got its own cleaning device. There's also then always like a container that you put the cleaning device in. Have you ever seen these videos? They're quite incredible. They just terrify me, because it's just, there's like one thing for one purpose, and there is the container for it. So there are two things for every one need. So Max Neef is saying this is the danger of certain ways of thinking about needs that abstract them from satisfiers. They tend to be singular, and this is going to lead to an overproliferation of things. An inhibiting satisfier satisfies one need, but only by preventing other needs from being satisfied. So in this particular case, I have a need for understanding, and the satisfier could be a strict classroom, a very strict teacher-centered classroom. That's going to work. You're going to get a certain level of understanding. But it can be evaluated, according to Max Neef, by the extent to which it inhibits a whole bunch of other satisfiers. The kids who are learning in an authoritarian classroom are being denied participation, creation, identity, freedom. So you've now got these two critiques. One critique is that they are singular. The other critique is that they are inhibiting. The third critique is that they pretend to satisfy and don't. They actually make the need worse. So you should all know that that's the case with any kind of junk food or high glycemic index food. You're hungry, you have some junk food. It has a very short burst of energy. It's not the right type of energy, and very quickly you are going to be both hungry and exhausted as a result. So it's a pseudo-satisfier. It's doing one thing, it's pretending to do one thing, it's not actually really doing it very well. It's actually exacerbating the problem. So you can, all of this, by the way, is great ways to run crits. If you, in your, to be a momentary product manager for something, you can use these kind of critiques to, is this a singular satisfier? Is this an inhibiting satisfier? Is this a pseudo-satisfier? Worse, is this a violator or destroyer, which pretends to satisfy a need, but actually makes the need much worse? So in this particular case, a lot of them, they're all to do with protection. The classic example I always use is North Americans and gun culture. I have a need for protection. I buy a gun. Having a gun in the house is one of the greatest ways to die at the hand of a gun. Often because your toddler picks it up next to your bed where for some reason you're sleeping with a loaded gun. This is a daily occurrence. There's a very nice website, and you can go to it and see how many people last night were shot by a toddler in the family in America. It happens about once a day as far as I can see. So this is a classic example of what Max Neef would call a violating satisfier. It's actually not pseudo-satisfying, which is a temporary satisfaction. It's actually making the situation worse. It's an interesting challenge just to try and think for yourself whether you can think of violators outside of a need for protection. Okay, so I was telling you all this because when you think about needs in a Maslowian way, individuated and abstracted, you tend to come up with violators, pseudo-satisfiers, inhibitors, or singular satisfiers. So you can see where this is going, I hope, which is that Max Neef's primary interest is in what he calls synergic satisfiers. It's an odd word. A lot of people have since retranslated it as synergistic, but the word originally in his context was synergic. And so he's basically saying that the aim of need satisfaction is to always satisfy one need in ways that satisfy many needs. So if you are needing to satisfy participation, the good thing about democratic community organisations, grassroots community, not just once in a 4 years, 3 years vote, is that you will get some protection because you know people and they'll look out for you. You're getting affection, you're getting leisure, creation, identity, freedom. So you're basically getting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of the 10 apparently categories of needs. So now you have an objective. And this is the point of this whole big long lecture, to give you the history of needs and the shift from Maslow to Max Neef, is to say that transition design is always using synergic satisfiers. So you need to crit propositions as being pseudo or violators or inhibitors, etc. And then you need to work out how do you convert them into synergic satisfiers. There's 2 reasons why you do that. Now, again, I haven't explained this to you, but some of you may know this, that transition design is vision-led. So at some point you need to actually spend a whole time doing visioning, and some of you have got that in some of your projects. You actually want to do visioning sessions, hopefully always participatory. Don't do visioning alone, it's pointless. So you're doing participatory visioning, you're getting diverse stakeholders together and they're trying to imagine a preferential future. And what will be preferential is that it will be a system, because its systems change from system A to system B. System B is preferential because it synergic satisfies. It has ways of satisfying needs that cover many needs and don't do any inhibiting or violating, etc. The other, which is more complicated and not possible for me to explain right now, but I'll have a bit of a go next week, is that synergic need satisfiers are really important when trying to do backcasting. So it's hard to do visioning because we're so used to being dystopic or even utopic. It's really hard to be thinking about practical, material visions of the future. But if you do come up with a vision of the future and try to backcast, backcasting is a very particular technique. It's even harder to do. And one of the main tricks in backcasting is to imagine the moment in which one need satisfier is combining with another need satisfier so that you're getting synergic satisfiers. And people adopt the new one because they can feel the power of synergic need satisfiers. Okay, but I can't really explain that. I'm just going to promise you that synergic satisfiers are really good for doing general design. They're absolutely crucial to getting to a cosmopolitan localist future through transition design. And they're really useful when trying to design pathways, multiple steps to get there. All right, nearly finished, and then we'll talk a bit. So I said I was going to go back to this thing. I just want you to look at now the other columns in this. So this is what's interesting. I said before, Maslow tends to be noun-based, and so the verb of need satisfaction is one of having, a very propertied version. Max Neef identifies that there are many different ways in which we experience a need, not only the need to have something, but we also have a need to do things, a need to interact in particular ways, and a need to be in particular ways. So in fact, there aren't just 10 needs in Manfred Max Neef. There are in fact 40 groups of needs. I have a need for a sense of humor, I have a need for work, I have a need for dwelling, I have a need for family, I have a need for education and teachers, I have a need for being creative, for having creative things, I need to have creative things, to do creative things, I need to interact creatively. I have all these different types of needs. So again, this matrix is really generative for ideation in design, and it's really great for crit in design, and it stops you thinking in a very product, goods dominant logic version of design. It helps you think about services because services are interactions and they're doings, and they're moments in which people are being together in particular ways. So it's not that there's needs on the left and then kind of satisfies on the right, but they're not really needs, they're need satisfiers or needed satisfiers. They're sort of mixes. So they're no longer abstracting needs from the satisfiers. So I think that's what's interesting about this. And when you see it this way, this is my last clue for reading Max Neef the right way. When you see it this way, you suddenly realize the names down the left, subsistence, protection, affection, are just ways of categorizing all the things that are in the rest of the row. It's not there is a need for subsistence. There is a need for health and food and feeding and social settings, which can all be categorized as types of subsistence. You can actually categorize them differently, and there are different versions of Max Neef's 10 categories. So just to say that again, you know, if you look along the row of identity, I want to be sort of belonging, I want to have a religion, I want to do commitments, I want to engage in maturation and change over time with other people. If I was to categorize those, I might categorize all those needed satisfiers as identity. So it's a bit complicated. I haven't done a great job of explaining it, and we can talk about it a bit more, but I just really think it's both complicated and much more generative and useful for designing. Okay, so when colleagues of mine have designed with it, they use circular modes. This comes from a woman who did a PhD with me on the sharing economy at CMU, whose name I've suddenly forgotten, which is terrible. But these were her kind of spider graphs of just kind of looking for synergic satisfiers. So these were particular services, daycare services in London, a community park in Athens, as you can see. And they were kind of read in terms of how much they satisfied particular satisfiers. These were the subjective interpretations. The further out, the more. You can sort of see which ones they weren't. This image comes from some recent graduates working at a bank doing a work on how the bank might help primarily women flee domestic violence, partner violence. And of course, the bank was thinking purely about protection, just giving them money because it's a bank. So ways in which women could walk in and say, I need to flee a relationship and I've been denied access to money by my partner. Can I have money? And the students recognized there was a need to think about multiple satisfiers, synergic satisfiers, and the way in which the bank could actually facilitate somebody going and getting a haircut, buying some new clothes, taking a cooking class and just feeling like a decent human being again. That in fact, this was a much, much richer way of doing escape than merely just giving money and saying, go to a bleak shelter. But again, it's a circular form just to maintain that non-hierarchical. So just to give you some ideas about the way you might use this. Okay. Last quick thing to say is there's a meta transition here. The meta transition is from singular, convenience-oriented, efficiency-oriented versions of need satisfaction to synergic satisfiers. Synergic satisfiers help transitions, but there's also a big transition we need to make as societies from needs-based regimes, socio-technical regimes, to more synergic ways of living. And I've given a hint there, and I'll come back to this next way. One of the primary ways to do this is to help people experience synergic satisfiers. People are so used to experiencing singular, inhibiting pseudo-satisfiers that they will often think initially the synergic satisfier looks like more work. It has more social friction, it has many things going on, slightly more complicated. But then when they experience it, they start to get a sense of the synergic satisfier. So if you're trying to get people to bicycle, you don't just give them a bike, you actually have to living lab. You give them a service of learning to bicycle, you commute with them, you give them some sociality, and then over time, you do it for about a month, they start to develop new habits, they adjust their practices, they make a transition, and they start to experience the synergic satisfier of bicycling, which is seeing the city differently, feeling a little bit fitter, being introduced to a new community of cyclists, not suffering road rage, though still suffering road rage because the drivers are yelling at you. But you have to give people experiences of synergic satisfiers for them to begin to realize that synergic satisfiers are more satisfying in that way. And this is an overall transition we're trying to make out of neoliberalism into something slightly more sustainable. Okay, so I'm just calling up some of these projects. The Regenerate project, which is a really interesting one. I would describe it in terms of bounded socio-technical experiments, trying to create opportunities to Living Lab. How do you kind of make safe spaces from current economic pressures in which people could experiment with regenerative agriculture? Or the one I found really interesting was this proposition that people kind of trying to design something that would allow them to experience non-paid labor, non-unpaid family labor, how to try and get a version of sustainable economics into the experience. Obviously, I think, you know, the synergic satisfiers are what this project is about on my read, understanding nothing about the project other than what I've seen. This is somebody trying to get from singular, sometimes even violating need satisfiers. I need to have a business. I just need to increase productivity from the ground. We just need to work really hard and throw lots of toxics at it so that we can sell a crop. And it's just a one crop and we sell it and then we get money. And then with money, we try to satisfy all our other satisfiers. A regenerative agriculture is the idea that the actual work itself is not just about growing the food, but it grows the people. It makes these spaces for alternative economies. So I think this one is the most natural fit for just thinking, oh, this is exactly the kind of Max Neefian way of doing it versus a kind of Maslowian one. The Maslowian one says, well, if we can just give them some money, then they'll have enough time to experiment. Rather than saying, well, actually the transition of finding, working with them to create those spaces of experimentation will be what will actually make the process more satisfying. Similarly with this one, obviously, again, having play devices that are not just toxic and short-lived play devices, but are themselves part of wider satisfiers. They're not just satisfying the need for play, but they're providing satisfiers for environmental livelihood of a community and sociality. So the kind of proposition that's emerging, as I can see, is a kind of toy library. They have things here which are toy trucks. They just trucks that the local council provides. It drives to a park and they open the back of it and dump all the toys on the ground, and then kids come running. It's like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Oh no, the other one. Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. The children come running, they play with all the toys, and then at the end of the day, the toys are put back. And the parents see that this is much more satisfying because they don't have to constantly be buying toys or stepping on toys at home, and the kids love getting out and they're out in the grass, etc. So I can't remember this one so much. Oh, again, sort of issues of just facilitating civic engagement. Often the way people handle migration issues is a very Maslowian one. Refugees, people fleeing, we just need to provide protection, blankets, minimum food, basic housing. And so I just think, you know, we understand the limits of that kind of very developmentalist way of approaching these issues. We understand that it's sometimes dangerous to say, well, we actually should be doing theatre in a refugee camp, because it becomes a way of saying we're not actually dealing with migration issues and we're just using society as a spectacle. But done well, it's about saying people deserve more than just tents in a tent village. There should also be cultural provisions in that way. So I think there's lots of precedents of trying to think about synergic satisfiers in that domain. Obviously, this one about motivations are precisely at that nexus between sort of theory X and Y and Z and a more Max Neefian approach to just how it is. And in fact, if you look at most tech companies and innovation companies these days, they're kind of Maslowian in that you don't need to eat at home. We provide 3 meals a day. There's sort of, you know, food stations every 2 meters in the Facebook campus. But on the other hand, they're also trying to say, well, we provide all satisfiers to you here. And it's kind of bad in a way. It's very lucky. It's bad because it's privileged. It's bad because it tends to create a kind of groupthink that you never experience anything outside of some, you know, meta campus. But on the other hand, it provides a particularly interesting way of thinking about motivation at work and what is it that are the satisfiers of work and how we can start to have satisfiers that aren't just maximized productivity. And again, yeah, just running through this so we can have a chat. The kind of neighbours, again, not just sort of facilitating sociality as a singular satisfier, but trying to work out how that could be around other things. So this always makes me think of Ezio Manzini's work on sustainable everyday, and the idea that just saying to somebody, what skills do you have? What skills do you have? What do other skills in the nearby building need? Put those two people together, not only is there need satisfaction in terms of somebody needing repair, there's sociality. So you're creating social bonds, but you don't create social bonds directly. You do it by enabling other things, and that leads to a situation of transitioning to a more sort of synergic satisfiers. Okay, I rushed through that. I talked for way too long, which is always my habit. But you're finally free of my voice for 30 seconds until you ask me a question. I'll have a look at the chat while you think. Oh, great. Alex got my chitty chitty bang bang reference. He's a very famous, I didn't realize this is the guy who played that character, who still haunts me nightmarishly, like from being a child so long ago, I didn't realize is a very famous Australian ballet dancer who just died a couple of years ago, I think. Okay. Just looking at that reference there, there's an interesting, I think, problematic, maybe dated, possibly sexist thing in some of those Manfred Max Neef tables I showed you. And I'll ship you the slides, by the way, but they're all just images stolen from the web, about him saying that a singular satisfier is prostitution, sex work, which I think is a very problematic understanding of sex work. So I just draw your attention to that, because I think very few sex workers would say that the only thing they're doing is singular satisfier. You know, it's a very rich service in many different ways, and that's often the way it's sort of you're doing a transition in society to just accept a broader understanding of sex work, for example. So it is an interesting one to call out, as I can see someone did there. There was a lot. You must have questions or things you thought were problematic in what I said. Yeah, go.
Hi, thank you for the super master class. I'm totally. I saw that my students were organizing this, and I had to come. But yeah, I'm an outsider of the group. And thank you for the emails yesterday. That was great. I wanted to know more about, or problematize more, or think more about the vision and backcasting methods. But I don't know if this is something that you're planning to touch on next sessions. I was thinking that you mentioned the synergy of satisfiers? No.
Yep.
Satisfactions may become like a knot in that timeline. But
That's
is it when we look back in history, maybe the separation of solutions, it also mark a knot in the timeline. And actually, the whole vision and backcasting is one of my struggles with transition, because it's very capitalist and Western and status quo's way of thinking. I mean, it could be no vision, it could be embodiment, or it could be something else instead of vision. And the thought that the time is in a line and that I have not is also very capitalist. And but I don't know if this is a discussion that we're gonna have, that you have planned for the future, or because you kind of place it there and very quickly left, or can we start thinking about that now in terms of the needs for the next time or something?
So those are fantastic points. I think it will be more of the discussion next week. I'll try and talk a bit about that for that reason. If I can just pick out two things from what you said, which I thought were great points. The first is that a lot of the work that Terry and Gideon in particular do or facilitate when tackling transition design is to ask people to think about past ways in which these needs were satisfied, and think about different organizations of how this system that you're trying to transition was previously. So don't only take the present state as the one you're working with. And you will often find very rich precedents for alternative ways of organizing the system, the organization, the society in the past. It's often problematic. I often will have a fight with Gideon, for example, who's fond of black and white images of often peasant women, kind of Middle European peasant women around a collective washing area. So they're all doing the washing, the clothes washing in a big sort of pool. And he'll use this image to kind of show synergic satisfiers sometimes, because there's particular needs being satisfied, but there's obviously a lot of socializing going on. And obviously another way to read that image is it's a very problematically patriarchal image in terms of the division of labor. And you're talking about a quite oppressive group of societies, or at least they get read as oppressive from a particularly modern European perspective about what is apparently free and liberal. So it's a Gideon's response is to always say there are things to learn from that, what's depicted in that historical image, not just let's throw the whole thing out because it also had political problems. So it becomes a really interesting question to kind of think through. And I shouldn't have gone that far into that anecdote, except to say definitely the past is a really important thing to draw on, whereas it's very designer innovation and European and capitalist to think we just need to come up with new things. It's all about the new. So I definitely take that point. I think that's important. And then I think your point about what you were describing as knots, and I was talking about convergent switch points, it is, and it's still got a problematic version of future and an ocular-centric version of vision, which I heard you critique, and a kind of linear developmentalism, except that the switch points in any transition pathway are actually what's interesting about the transition pathway. So it has linearity, but it's less linear than your standard backcasting, which tends to just be small, medium, big, or 1 + 2 + 3 = 4. So it tends, what we try to identify is that you can begin to think about strange attractors in a web. You can begin to think about multiple pathways. And the point about being a transition designer is not to make a plan and then say, right, that's it. 1, 2, 3, we just do it. We do this, and then we do this, and then we do this, and then we're there. The point is to have a reason to start. So I've got a plan. The next move is this, but then to start to sense. And so a question was on the Slack channel about the waiting and observing. I think this kind of idea of you see and you retest the map. So this is much closer to what Lucy Suchman calls situated actions rather than plans. So I think the critique's valid. We're just trying to sort of bend it. The other thing is it's still transition design, right? That's what I meant at the beginning when I talked about politics. It's still design, and design in this version is the very essence of Western modernity and capitalism. We don't have imperialism, and we don't have capitalism without design. So this is kind of an attempt to do design against design or design against capitalism, and there's always a danger that it's just reinforcing what it's trying to change. Sorry, too long an answer, Alex.
Yeah, thank you. So firstly, this was really, really interesting, just lecture. So thank you very much for that. I wanted to ask, maybe this is a slightly repetitive question, but about the nature of needs, because the reason I'm kind of growing increasingly, like I find the word a bit problematic in that it presupposes kind of an acute desire to do something, on the part of the quote unquote user, right? But a lot of services, they are like good ones, at least. They also deal with unconscious kind of things that we need, right? So for example, good traffic crossing light, right, is built around a user whose face is hidden in their mobile phone, right?
Yeah.
Who's not thinking about the car, and the good service kind of leads on there. So I wanted to ask you kind of how do we navigate the various gradations of needs, which range from kind of acute to passive, but their importance is not really correlated to those approaches.
I think, the least thing you can see in the Max Neef is because it's complicated, you can't just do it to people. You have to do it with people. In which case, the participatory nature just means that any of the ranking is something that they are doing, not something that you are doing. So I'm always worried about unconscious needs versus needs that someone has in a situation that they don't have time to think about or have been trained out of thinking out of. And the task of the design is, first of all, to get them to notice it and validate whether that is a case and then begin to work with it. So I've got a cheap answer there, which is that participation can negotiate some of that. I think the other thing I'm trying to do with the Max Neef, and that I think why transition design focuses so much on it, is precisely as I said at the beginning, it is an attempt to break with the user needs model of needs and a kind of behaviorist account of humans. And it is an attempt to kind of have a much richer picture of the human than human-centered design. And so the human that kind of emerges spread out over 40 categories of having, being, doing, and interacting in all those different ways. And obviously it's not limited, you can kind of keep going. I just feel like it's a much more interesting human, and the kind of things you will design will never be able to be of the nature of a traffic light, even if it takes into account looking down. Like in a weird way, you can only design those things with a more hierarchical version of needs, which is why I think Max Neef lends itself to both transition and service design and not product design. It's difficult to get product designers because they're going to have to make choices to materialize these things. So it's a great question, but I think precisely that non-abstracting, non-hierarchical is what Max Neef's needed satisfiers, table of needed satisfiers, I think helps us to think about. It's a bit like give it a go. I feel like I've talked way too long, lecture style, abstractly, starting with history, and might have lost you. So I really would encourage you to try and use the matrix and try and work with it. And you'll start to see that it really shouldn't be called a needs matrix. Like it actually does liberate you from a very needs driven way of designing, but it's called needs and it starts with that. Yeah, sorry, it was a great question, Alex. I don't think I've done it justice, but.
Thank you. There's also a question in the chat from Ada before it gets lost.
I saw Ada's one. We should talk about it. Yeah. Do you want to talk about it?
Maybe that was a bit specific of my project, but since Male was talking about visioning, and that's something I kind of tried to do while I was interviewing farmers at the beginning of my project, which was actually my abstract. And I kind of found it quite problematic and hard. I even developed these artifacts, like these newspapers from the future. I translated to local language. I kind of tried to use that to talk about different scenarios, but even that way, it was quite hard to get out of the sense of hopelessness and just one vision of the future, which was big companies will come, take out all our land, just produce more. But at the same time, they were like, oh, this is the only way to do things and still produce. So it's kind of like I found it quite hard to use designer tools with a public that might not be really used to designer tools to do all this. So I'm not sure if it's a question or just a comment, and if you have any suggestion or, yeah.
No, it's a fantastic observation, and it also sounds like it would be depressingly frustrating, meaning frustrating because you don't get to do what you want, and then realizing, yeah, just how far gone the situation is when people are kind of feeling that cynical about what kind of happens. And so I'm not sure my answers will respond to the lived experience of those farmers that you've tried working with. I think it's interesting, your observation that sort of designerly tools don't, possibly even in their aesthetic, immediately look like exactly what they're imagining is going to come and take away their land. It's like your canvas looks like the same logo of the company of the truck I just saw driving down the road. So one answer is like, make sure that the tools have been designed in their aesthetic. I think we often think tools are neutral, but I think it's really important to make them feel recognizable to them. The second comment is a little bit the comment to Marla's comment at the beginning. The only strategy I've found in situations of that, you have to work very hard when visioning. We can talk about this a bit next week, but to sensitize people to being able to imagine a future and being able to think that change can happen and different kind of change can happen. And the past, the recent past and distant past are good sources for that. So getting a nostalgic conversation about other ways in which society used to be organized, getting people telling those kind of stories. And then even sort of, then you can sort of start with that and people will go into the good old days and this is how it used to be. And I remember my grandfather used to farm this way, and, you know, on the one hand. And then on the other hand, then flipping to something like something that's happened in the last 10 years. And it can be as neoliberal as people being Airbnb or traveling. Can you remember when you went to the United Kingdom and you didn't have a mobile phone? And that was only 15 years ago. And you used to have great big books and maps that you used to read from. And just this moment of realizing some things, not all, some things can change quite quickly. And so if you can start to connect those two moments, if you have this kind of like nostalgic moment and you have this change has happened, and it's sort of more neutral, it's just like the arrival of phones and travel is okay, and, you know, and then overnight large company comes and wipes out a whole region. You choosing something like a phone, if you can connect those two moments, nostalgia and change, and then start thinking about the future, there's just this possibility that it's possible to start thinking, oh, okay, we could recover this in this time period. So it's now possibly worth thinking about. Now, again, I don't know if that would work in the context that you're talking about, but I've seen it work in a couple of contexts where there's that, but they don't seem to have the level of despair that you're describing.
Thank you.
Thank you for the brilliant talk. It was very inspiring. I've been meaning to ask you since last week, and my thoughts resonate with Ada and Male regarding visioning and backcasting. What are the other ways of doing transition design apart from visioning and backcasting? For example, you talked about finding synergic satisfiers today, which was like really good because it broadened our perspective. But then, yeah, like in my case, when I'm trying to solve, sort of shift the mindsets of consumption, or where in a scenario where parents see this as a need for them to be able to provide a lot of gifts for their children to open during Christmas. So what are the other ways of doing transition design to sort of shift consumer mindsets, or like, you know, to move towards a sharing consumption thing apart from doing backcasting and visioning?
So one answer is there are lots of other ways, but they're not transition design. So I would kind of still insist that despite what I think is the valid critique that Marla was making, there is still a need to try and preserve not futuring, but visioning. And it doesn't have to be ocular-centric, but just some sense that another world is possible, you know, this kind of slogan. So, you know, this kind of Graeber slogan or this Amartya Sen slogan I just think that's core. Like, this is vision-led designing. It's an attempt to recover vision-led designing, which is I think so much of the world that I see and design is about small steps, agile, follow, pivot, etc. And that's what's leading us to disaster. So despite the critique of vision, I still sort of think it's necessary. So my one answer is, well, there are other ways of doing it, but it's not transition design. So transition design is vision-led. It's about making a vision and trying to do a backcast, even though that's difficult and problematic. But certainly the one I tried to describe a little bit today, which is the thing in the middle, is making safe spaces for trying out other ways of living, not for a day. This isn't a prototype. This isn't just even like a field trial. This is a living lab. A living lab must be at least 1 to 3 months, I think, is optimum. And you create the conditions. You often have to incentivize people. You have to find ways in which they break with their current ways of living. And you ask them, you design a service to help them live that way for a while. So you're literally like forcing the future onto them, with their consent, obviously, to experiment and try something out. So they're trying cycling for a while. They're trying regenerative agriculture. They're trying a giftless celebration. So, using service design to create these experiences that people will then have and can live with and notice all the other adjustments they have to make in their life and can start to feel synergic satisfiers. I think this is another crucial part. It's sometimes called prefigurative design because you're taking a bit of the future and you're prefiguring it in the present. You're taking system B and you're putting it in the current regime. So, just any time you go somewhere and it's like no gifts, or everybody has to just kind of give a gift and there's nothing in the box. It's kind of like just experiments, but causing you to live with it longer than just a momentary focus group kind of experiment. So that was my quick answer. I hope that explained.
Yeah, thank you.
We have a few comments in the chat, and I think a question from Marina.
I'm actually still processing all this information that Cameron and everyone else kind of bringing in. I think while I'm doing a project around the neighborhood and getting people to kind of integrate more and talk to each other, but I don't know, I think there's a side of me that, well, talking to people, I noticed that most of them are very happy. We actually are a very privileged neighborhood. So it feels like most needs are actually being met, but there's also a willingness to do more. So I'm not sure how relevant it is to think about transition design or even service design in situations where things are actually going relatively smooth. And then the problems that are being picked up by people, I'm a bit scared that it's almost like colonizing problems, because it is people who are actually happy but see a huge divide between the kind of more affluent part of the neighborhood with the huge council state. And I think there's almost like, people are like, why can't we not be closer together? But I'm thinking, where is this desire coming from? Why do we feel this need? So I think I'm a bit in conflict on how to actually frame it in a way. I don't know. It's more of a comment. I don't have a question.
It's a great comment. And again, I can only sort of speak adjacently to it and kind of your experience of these neighborhoods and those kind of issues. I hadn't kind of thought about situations in which people are feeling quite a lot of synergic satisfiers already, and how do you get. But the two comments I'll make are, as I sort of indicated last week, I'm spending a lot of time thinking about transition design from problem initiated contexts. So context in which somebody has a problem, it's quite a discrete problem, and then I am trying to go in there and help them escalate the problem so that it becomes a source of transition. As I indicated, Terry and Gideon tend to spend a lot more time thinking about large wicked problems and assembling groups of people who can begin to imagine where there might be an intervention point in it. So one of the responses I have is people can feel very satisfied with their day-to-day life. It would be an odd group of people who weren't aware that there are also large societal problems, and not just a problem neighborhood next door, but that issues of an aging population or issues of climate change or issues of inequality in general are not also things that we need to be thinking about. And so in that case, it's trying to invite people into a space because of the fact that they have a certain luxury to lend themselves to other problems to think about. So it's not so much your problem, it's our problem. And just trying to make that frame shift so that people can begin to think in that way. And then the second is that one of the big discourses about need is sacrifice. So the whole point about the hierarchy is that you're supposed to not sacrifice. Like a hierarchy says you do something and only then do you think about the next level. So there is no sense of sacrifice because you're always satisfying base needs and then developing new needs on top of that. Whereas obviously most of our existence as humans can be interpreted as versions of sacrifice in which I give up something. I actually make a need for myself. I go without food. I have money and I give it to someone else. I have time and I give it to someone else. And so there's a kind of version in ways in which society gifting and the whole purpose of service is somebody somewhere is actually sacrificing. They're making a need. They're creating a need for themselves. So, you know, if I spend my time now talking to you, talking about transition design, I'm not helping my daughter struggling with some maths for her matriculation exam next door, which is not something I can do actually. So, but let's imagine I could. You know, so there's obviously trade-offs, it's always called, but some kind of sacrifice. So I'm kind of making a need now. I now have a need for a maths tutor because I've decided to go here. So I have this situation of luxury, but I'm opting somewhere else. So I'm just rambling to say maybe thinking about whose problem and not just their problem, but our problem. And then secondly, this issue of, well, it's not just only about satisfies, it's also about what you decide to contribute to, and that will you'll be in a position of need then, because you've redirected some of your satisfiers to thinking about this problem or helping other people or gifting, etc. I don't know if that helps. It was a good question.
That helps. Thank you.
Hello, sorry to interrupt. Just to honor everyone's time, could we take just one last question and then we'll close up for this session? Thank you.
Well, Damien, you put that question in there about a kind of example of participatory.
Which could also be done in Slack, actually.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm just trying to think of a good example, because in some ways what I'm saying is all the projects have to have this kind of participatory moment. So there's always this weird moment where you have to kind of, it's the tension of all service. You have to become a bit of a teacher for a while to teach the participants not to think about needs in a Maslow way, which is the one that's seeped into most Western dominated cultures, to then introduce something like the matrix, which can come as a circle and just say, here are somebody else's versions of this. Now begin to map this. So the diagrams I showed you, both in the domestic violence project and in the evaluation, I still can't remember her name, in her PhD, I'll put it in the Slack channel. They were moments in which the community centre were brought and said, okay, well, here's 10 categories. They're not comprehensive. Is this community daycare? Which of these is it satisfying? And they're revelatory moments. They're moments in which people realize either they have lacks they didn't have, to go to Marina's question, or, you know, which is a little bit Alex's question previously about a kind of unconscious need. But in that case, it's not an unconscious need. It's just they didn't realize that their life could be more satisfied than it is at the moment, because they've only got a materialistic one. I've seen the comments about money in the chat. So I think, yeah, it's always participatory, and it's always these revelatory. You have to teach it, but then people use it. So it's not as easy as just like pulling out the canvas and going, let's do this exercise now. You kind of have to explain. And yeah, then it does become this revelatory moment of people thinking quite differently about what they are valuing. I should say there's a lot of confusion when you do this and in the discourse between values, needs, etc. Yeah, it's a confusing thing, and I could try and explain it differently to make it make more sense. Someone just popped in and had a question, I thought, or was that the last question?
Yeah, maybe I'll just check in with Sarah. Is it a question you have, or a comment that you want to make?
It's like an ending thing that could transition to the next session, because it's related a little bit. Some of the things you were mentioning, again, like setting the stage, talking about, we talked last time and even this time about explaining some of these concepts and being a teacher and doing the visioning. So all of this is a kind of a long process that needs to happen in a way. And sometimes you really have a very specific set of time with people. Even more when you're trying to do public engagement, you can get someone for 10 minutes, maximum an hour. So how can we kind of, especially when we're trying to do it more on a public level, how can we do all of these different parts and phases from transition design with our participants in order for it to really be participatory as well? So it can come in the next session, I think, but this is something I'm interested in.
Okay, yeah, it's a great question. The answer is you don't. Right, so yeah, it's yeah, or the cheeky answer is, if you've only got 10 minutes, spend that 10 minutes developing a relationship with the person so that they're convinced that they will give you more time. Don't do the thing that you're supposed to do. Do the thing that builds the space for you to do something properly. But yeah, it is the problem that the way participation arrives in service design projects from governments in particular are and the version of the public. So the other quick answer is it's about making new publics, new locals, new small locals. If the project is framed in terms of the public, it's kind of lost already. Yeah, but that's a cheeky answer. But let's talk about that next week.
All right, thank you. I think we'll kind of close this session for today. Well, thank you so much for your generosity, Cameron. And I think for the rest of us who still have questions and musings and thoughts, the students, we do plan to also, we'll take a short break and then we'll come back to this call and do a short debrief with each other, and we'll kind of log all our thoughts and questions also on Miro, and then we'll see which ones we want to bring in for the next session as well, and we'll communicate all of this to you, Cameron, over Slack.
Great.
But
and can I say quickly, if you want to totally define what happens next week with questions that I run through and answer, that might be a really good way to do it. So I'm totally happy to, like, this was very lecture mode, and I can give you another one and we can talk about something else that occurred to me looking at your work that might be interesting. But it might actually be more productive if you have this little session now and really think, no, talk about, I just saw one then, talk about visioning, talk about this, how do you handle publics? You can give me a list of questions and I'll be your servant.
That's awesome. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Okay,
thanks everybody.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you everyone else for joining and participating. For those who, well, thank you, Cameron. I think for those who are interested, we will to stay back to just talk about what has happened. I think we can do like a 10-minute break. Come back at 11:50. We'll just spend like 30 minutes with each other talking about things and logging like questions and see if we want to make any requests of the next session. If not, everyone else, well, thank you for joining us. Please feel free to communicate with us over Slack as well. If you also have any questions or requests or comments. Yeah, thanks everyone. We'll see you in 10 minutes.
And for those who we will not see in 10 minutes, the next session is this time next week. So see you then.
See you.
Damien, we come back in the same link.
Yeah, this link, yeah.
Okay, see you in a bit.